if you want to say it's bodily or physical, that's fine, but it's bodily or physical in a way that nothing else we know is bodily or physical. I mean, I don't know anybody who can walk through a wall. Calvin thinks that when Jesus rises from the dead, he has his same physical body, so much so that when he shows up in a room in John 20, Calvin says he went through the door. He didn't walk through the wall. So the first thing is that I think all of these traditions here are early. Okay? I think they're all early. I actually think that all of them refer to historical experiences.
This one.
Yeah, my view is, this is the earliest written, oral, composed a statement of the early Christians that we possess. I found in the literature, scholars, I really didn't find anybody except a few people that, and they, one of them happened to be a mythicist, but people that would say that it was an interpolation or something like that. But pretty much across the literature I find of New Testament scholarship that 1 Corinthians 15, that creedal statement that Paul is quoting, goes back within, at most, the latest 10 years after Jesus' death. And, the late James Dunn, he said within months. So a spectrum of within months of Jesus' death to within 10 years of Jesus' death. This creedal statement that Paul quotes, and he delivered to the Corinthians, and he had received it sometime before that, that was composed that early, which I find extraordinary. I mean, I think it's the definition of extraordinary.
Can I just read it out, just for those who maybe don't know it immediately? But 1 Corinthians 15, verses 5 to 8 says this. Well, I'll go from verse 3, actually, where it says, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to someone untimely born, he appeared also to me." And the reason why you and other scholars see this as so significant, as you say, is because it's not only in a letter of Paul, which makes it quite early to start with, but it feels like he's quoting something which has its origins even before that. You say to at least within 10 years of the events that it's claiming, and some I know date it right to within a couple of years or even months from the date of the events. So this for you, that, I mean, where would you say, where would you land in terms of its significance yourself, Justin?
I would agree with James Dunn that it was months. I mean, it just makes sense to me that after the ascension, after Pentecost, that as the apostles started to go out and proclaim the death, burial, and resurrection, they would have come up with some kind of memorizable catechism type teaching that was easy to memorize, and then it probably got it was a shortened form of the story that we get in narrative form in the Gospels and the Passion narratives. But Christ died, so this would have been the story of his sufferings, his trials, his time under Pilate, crucified under Pilate. He's buried by whom? It's in the passive tense in the creedal statement. Buried by Joseph of Arimathea in his tomb, and then he was raised, and then this probably had on the third day. So this is maybe a reference to the fact that the women found it, led by Mary Magdalene, found it on the third day, and then he appeared to a number of people, and so we get those some of those same appearances at the end of the Gospels. And so I think it was a way to teach the earliest followers, these early, they probably weren't even called Christians then, but maybe they were called the Nazarenes. I don't know what they were called that early, the way, according to Acts, but they, this would have been an easy, memorizable way to have the story.
Justin Bass claims that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 proves the resurrection was believed just months after Jesus died, as if that makes it historically reliable. But belief isn't the same as evidence, and early creeds don't confirm a bodily resurrection. First, this creed isn't an eyewitness account. It's a second-hand formula Paul says he received, likely from other believers, and he never met Jesus during his life. Paul himself admits in Galatians 1:12 that his knowledge of Jesus came through revelation, not history. His appearance of Jesus is a vision, not a physical encounter. Second, the language used, especially ophtha, was seen, is used throughout ancient texts for visions, dreams, or spiritual experiences, not physical resurrections. In fact, in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, ophtha is used to describe angelic or divine appearances, not flesh and blood events. Third, as Dale Allison and Bart Ehrman both point out, many religious movements have early creeds and strong beliefs. But that doesn't make their supernatural claims true. Early Mormons believed Joseph Smith saw God the Father and Jesus, and they had structured creeds too. Yet we don't treat that as historical proof. So the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 may show how quickly beliefs spread, but it doesn't confirm what actually happened, and it certainly doesn't prove a dead man came back in a physical body.
Well, it's certainly significant, and it's also fascinating and provocative. So I have here disagreed with lots of my colleagues about their specificity. So the first thing is that I think all of these traditions here are early. Okay, I think they're all early. I actually think that all of them refer to historical experiences. All right. I'm simply not sure whether this creed was originally formulated in, let's say, Antioch, Damascus, Jerusalem. I don't know. I don't know whether originally there was an Aramaic version of this, or this was originally composed in Greek. I can't tell you whether it's AD 34 or AD 39. I'm not sure. But for me, the main point is that the content, whenever it was officially put together, and by the way, I don't know if Justin agrees with this, but I think it grows. That is, in my book, at least the most recent book, I argue that it might have originally ended with the 12, and then we get some material added. Maybe Paul's adding it. Paul certainly adds his own thing at the end. So I don't know. It might grow in 2 or 3 stages. That's possible. But at the end of the day, I think the important point is that the experiences back here aren't behind this, they're real. I don't think this is folklore. I don't think this is secondhand. And it is a fact that Paul's talking about himself. He refers to Peter, who's somebody he knows. He's referring to James, somebody he knows. He seems to know something about the 500, whoever they were. And he knows also John, son of Zebedee, and presumably, more than just a couple of the 12. So again, what this shows you is that this belief, and I said this earlier, this belief goes way back, and some of these experiences go way back. Now, I don't know, for example, when the experience to the 500, whatever it was, took place. It might be post-Pentecost, right, for me. In fact, the fact that there is no, probably in my mind, no appearance to James or the 500 in the Gospels is just easily explained if they're later events, right? It's just an easy, straightforward explanation of something somebody wonders about. In any case, I agree with that. Of course, how you explain this, that these people were convinced, or what lies behind those experiences, that's the big question. But I don't think, but I think you'd have to, well, let's just put it this way. I think if you're a skeptic, you're doing yourself a disservice by doubting what's going on here in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. I think it makes more sense if you're a skeptic, which I'm not. It makes more sense to try to explain these things rather than explaining them away and saying, this didn't happen. So we do have a few people who just doubt the appearance to the 500. I don't think they should be doing that, both from my own point of view and from their point of view.
That's interesting to hear you say that, because certainly in this passage, whereas I think because there are resurrection appearances in other sources, such as the Gospels, to some of the people that have been mentioned, whereas this claim of 500 seems to be novel to Paul. And so I have heard skeptics say, well, you can discount that because it's one source. It's just a throwaway line from Paul. You know, how on earth are we to know that whether, you know, it's true or not? But so why do you say you don't think you should dismiss it, Dale?
So I don't know how to argue against a consistent skepticism, because you can doubt anything. But Paul says some of them are still alive. And I just don't see any reason to think that that's a fictional statement. If it were fiction, he might say he appeared to 500, but I'm not I mean, he's really clever if he thinks, oh, I'm going to make this up and I'm going to add that a few of them are still alive. That's just not right. It's like the end of John, where you have the beloved disciple, and people, some people thought that Jesus was going to come before he died, right? But Jesus didn't say that. The people who think that the beloved disciple is just a literary figure and there's no history behind that, they just can't explain something like that. It makes no sense. There's a real something there. And so I think there's a real something there.
If I can
also, the ring of truth. Go ahead, Justin.
I agree. And I'll just, add to that point, Paul's credibility is on the line in Corinthians. One of the things he's doing in both 1st and 2nd Corinthians and some of the lost letters of Corinthians is defending his apostleship against these, so-called super apostles, as he calls them. And so he's defending his apostleship. He appeals to the fact that he's seen the risen Jesus. This is the direct commission he's been given. So if he appeals to what he says is more than half, basically, are still alive. So we're talking, plus 250. I don't know how he got the exact number, but clearly it was some kind of estimate. Maybe if you had a large crowd, you could say, oh, this, it's about 5. But either way, it's hundreds of people Paul is claiming in the 50s AD, and when he wrote 1 Corinthians, are readily available to encounter and to discuss the fact that they saw the risen Jesus. That's extraordinary, and I agree with Dale that it has to be at least historical that Paul is telling the truth, because if he was called out for that, this would have completely discredited him. So, not to mention the fact that it's in this very early testimony.
Well,
Paul's creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is not eyewitness evidence. It's a secondhand summary of what others believed. Even Dale Allison, who thinks these were genuine experiences, doesn't claim they prove a bodily resurrection. And here's why. Psychological studies show how easily people can have vivid, sincere experiences that aren't grounded in physical reality. In grief, people regularly report seeing or hearing loved ones who've died. One 2015 study in bereavement care found that over 60% of widowed seniors reported post-death contact experiences, visions, dreams, or a sensed presence. These aren't lies. They're emotional, internal events that feel incredibly real. Paul himself admits in Galatians 1:12 that he got his knowledge of Jesus by revelation, not history. In Acts, his experience is a blinding light and a voice, not a walking, talking Jesus with wounds. That's not a physical resurrection. It's a visionary encounter. And Justin Bass, citing this as evidence, ignores that even ancient people knew the difference between dreams, spirits, and actual bodies. That's why Luke 24 has Jesus eat fish to prove he's not a ghost. If the appearances in 1 Corinthians were bodily, why would the Gospels feel the need to add physical proof decades later? Finally, there's no mention of the 500 in any Gospel, which were written after Paul's letters. If hundreds of people saw Jesus, why is there silence from Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John? The best explanation is this. Paul was relaying community beliefs, not verifiable history. And belief isn't proof, not in religion, not in courts, and not in science.
I guess the way to introduce this is to contrast Luther and Calvin. So Calvin thinks that when Jesus rises from the dead, he has his same physical body, so much so that when he shows up in a room in John 20, Calvin says he went through the door. He didn't walk through the wall. And Calvin actually says that at the ascension, Jesus went to a place. He means a place somewhere in outer space or heaven or up there. Luther thinks that Jesus is in the Eucharist, and that Jesus lives within the believer. So for Luther, Jesus is a spiritual presence in a way he is not in Calvin. And I think that Jesus is a spiritual presence today. That is, I think he can be present with people when he is not bodily present. And I think that's always been true. And then when I look at the New Testament accounts, I know that Acts calls Paul's vision a vision. And by the way, I need to say here that I much prefer the term, I don't like the term hallucination. Visions, in my mind, can be veridical or non-veridical. That is, visions can involve seeing things that are not physically there in the normal sense, but there is information coming in or reality that you are encountering. And I've tried to hedge my bet in the book. So I say vision or vision-like experiences. And what I mean by that is that Jesus does seem to just pop in out of nowhere, and then he seems sometimes just to disappear, and people don't recognize him, or they have doubts, or they're confused about what's going on. Nobody can follow him when he leaves. He doesn't just walk away. So these sorts of things are vision-like, okay? And so I don't have any trouble being like Pannenberg and saying that these are not exactly the same experiences as me sitting in a room and talking to somebody who's sitting there. Now, I'm open-minded and not dogmatic. What I would say is that these experiences look to me to be vision-like, and I think there are veridical elements. That is, I don't think that they are just hallucinating. But there's also a theological problem here for me, and I just have to admit that when I look at human bodies, they are designed for survival in this world. So does the risen Jesus, if he has his body, does he have intestines? So Gregory of Nyssa thought about this and said, no, he can't. And by the way, Gregory of Nyssa is utterly orthodox, right? He's a saint and Cappadocian father and all that stuff. So he said, well, no, he doesn't have to eat, and he's not going to have intestines and so on. And you can do this with everything in the body. Why do you have lungs? So you can breathe air. Does Jesus need to breathe air now? Or does he have his reproductive organs? Why would he have them? Why would he need them? And so on. Is the whole body sort of redundant in his current state? So I then side with the old Lutheran theologians structurally. They would say Jesus rose from the dead, and the tomb was empty, and then he entered a new state at some point. Okay? He entered a new state at some point. I just don't have any problems theologically with saying he entered a new state from the beginning. And actually, Martin Luther, in opposing the Calvinists, he said, if you read Gospel of Matthew clearly, the women show up, and then the stone is rolled away, and he's not there. Luther said he went through the wall, or he just dissipated. He doesn't, whatever it is, he doesn't have a body like you or I have it. But Calvin actually thinks he does, right? And there are a lot of theologians in the tradition who think this. So the whole thing puzzles me, but you can see where my doubts are coming from. I can,
and it's really helpful just sketching out all of those sort of issues, and helpfully kind of puts me a little in the picture that for you it means that a bodily physical resurrection is not necessarily what's implied by the Gospels or by and so on.
Well, look, no, the early Christians believed that Jesus rose physically from the dead. Okay, they did. All right. And I think that the tomb was empty. Okay?
Amen again.
Okay. But you won't amen this. It just really puzzles me. It just really puzzles me. Okay?
Okay. Justin, where do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the early Christians, I mean, that's who we're talking about. When it comes to Paul, when it comes to, the earliest followers of Jesus, I think they definitely believed that it was a bodily resurrection. I mean, you look at the Gospels, I mean, clearly with the tomb empty, that means that something happened to Jesus's corpse, right? I mean, every inch of it, every molecule of Jesus's corpse, something happened. There was some kind of transformation. Now, what exactly is the resurrection body like? I mean, I feel like that's kind of the questions that Paul actually rebukes in 1 Corinthians 15. What a foolish question. Why do you ask that question? Well, I think it is fascinating. I agree with Dale that it's fascinating, and we don't know a lot of things about it. It clearly, if our resurrection body is going to be like Jesus's resurrection body, I mean, his body clearly defied physics. It was something extraordinary. It was something strange. Sometimes they didn't recognize him. All those things. But if you just stick with, like I said, Paul and those early statements in 1 Corinthians, I think we could at least say we know he's saying it's a bodily resurrection. And one of the reasons for that is Paul is a Pharisee. This is what, Pharisees definitely believed in bodily resurrection. We know that from Josephus. This is the Danielic type resurrection. Many who are asleep in the dust of the earth will rise. This is physical. This is the Maccabean type resurrection. They stick out their arms when they're being persecuted and say, cut off our arms. We'll get them back in the resurrection. That's physical. And so I think Paul and these earliest followers of Jesus, they believed in that kind of physical resurrection. So when they say Jesus rose from the dead, they mean he bodily rose from the dead. And that's what I think happened.
So I agree with that, and actually have 2 or 3 pages where I just gathered together Jewish texts on resurrection, and they are about bodies and flesh and graves and earth. There is only, I think, one possible text where you might have resurrection language used, where it's not that sort of thing. That's in the Book of Jubilees, and the passage isn't perfectly clear. But I would emphasize that I don't think Paul has John Calvin's idea of resurrection. That is, I think Paul believes in a radical transformation. It's bodily, but it's radical. So it's the seed, right? And then the plant, and they're just radically different. So what Paul is trying to do here, I think, is he's trying to stay within the tradition. He wants it to be bodily, and he believes in continuity, but it's almost as though the continuity is as minimal as possible at points. I mean, the seed and the tree. So I think it's a radical transformation. And again, if Luther's right, Jesus can walk through a wall. So if you want to say it's bodily or physical, that's fine, but it's bodily or physical in a way that nothing else we know is bodily or physical. I mean, I don't know anybody who can walk through a wall.
Well, but how many resurrection bodies do you know?
None.
Well,
None.
So if Jesus is the first of that Danielic resurrection that had been prophesied, then this is new creation. I mean, this is something that transcends all things, but it's physical. It goes back to Genesis 1, right? That everything God made was good. And so he's not going to abandon his matter, his physical creation. And so that's why to me it's consistent with the testimony from Genesis to Daniel to the early apostles.
Dale Allison hits the core issue here. Even if you grant that something happened, the nature of these appearances in the New Testament don't look physical in any ordinary sense. Jesus appears out of nowhere, vanishes, walks through walls, and sometimes isn't even recognized by his closest followers. That's not how real, physical bodies behave. It's more consistent with visionary or spiritual experiences, not resuscitated corpses. Justin Bass leans on the idea that Paul, as a Pharisee, would have assumed a bodily resurrection. But Paul's own language in 1 Corinthians 15 describes the resurrection body as radically different, spiritual, imperishable, like a seed turning into a completely new plant. Scholars like Bart Ehrman, Gerd Ludemann, and James Tabor all point out that Paul never mentions an empty tomb, nor does he describe a flesh-and-blood Jesus. That idea comes later, in the Gospels, decades after Paul. And by then, the theology had already evolved. And let's not forget, Paul never met Jesus alive. His appearance was a vision, not a walk on the road. The Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after Jesus' death, in different regions, by different authors with different agendas. So when Justin says, every molecule of Jesus' corpse was transformed, he's making a theological claim, not a historical one. Even Allison, who's not a skeptic, admits it doesn't make sense to talk about intestines, lungs, or reproductive organs in the risen Jesus. If you're saying it's bodily, but the body has no function, is that even a body in any meaningful sense? What we're left with are vision-like experiences, developed stories, and evolving theology, not verifiable proof that a man physically came back from the dead. So what do you think? Are these stories signs of a miraculous event, or the natural development of belief, grief, and mythology over time? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you want more breakdowns like this. Would you like me to continue with the next portion of their debate, or help build out a thumbnail, description, or title for this video?
You made a statement a couple of months ago that I found very interesting. And I don't claim to understand it, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot with it. You said that you were a cultural Christian. Okay, and so that raised a number of questions in my mind. You know, and the first question was,
You are changing the subject.
No, I'm not. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I may be leaping outside of the topic a bit to get back to it.
We can do cultural Christianity, but I think, because I have a list of questions that you wanted to ask, and that is one of them. But I think Professor Dawkins did ask you...
You were referring to the predictive power and to the utility of the stories.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's actually what I was trying to zero in on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so that was the point. Well, it seemed to me that your proclamation that you were a cultural Christian was a recognition and a statement that you had found something in the culture that had been derived from Christianity that you had an affinity with, and that there's some reason for that. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, well, what do you think that Christianity got right that allows you to make a statement like that? I mean, I know that there's differences perhaps in what we both think about the ultimate veracity of the biblical stories. Maybe there isn't differences. Like, it would take a lot of conversation to figure this out. But what did you mean by that? Like, what do you think that Christianity got right that would enable you to make a statement like that?
Virtually nothing. I meant by that no more than that I'm brought up in a Christian culture. I went to Christian schools. I therefore know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the Book of Common Prayer. I know the hymns. That's all. I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because maybe that's true and perhaps it's not. So the first question is, like, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical validity?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so for example, we could contrast mainstream UK Christianity with Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy.
There is a hierarchy.
Okay, a hierarchy that points to what?
Well, in the case of Islam, I dislike any religion which punishes apostasy with death, that throws gay people off high buildings, that practices clitoridectomy. That seems to me to place Islam on a lower level than Christianity, but that's not to say anything very positive about Christianity.
Well, it might be to say something positive about Christianity. Like, I think that question is open, because you might ask yourself, what did Christianity get right that led it away from those particular presumptions and towards something that you regard as more ethically appropriate? Like, this isn't a trivial question.
It's a very modest claim. There's not very much. I mean, to be better than a religion that throws gay people off high buildings is not really a very virtuous achievement.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true, because if you look at the barbarism that characterizes the human past, you might think that any progression whatsoever towards something approximating mercy and tolerance is nothing short of a bloody miracle.
Well,
like, people are pretty ruthless, and so are our chimpanzee cousins.
Yes, they are.
Right. So,
yes.
So we move forward into the light with great difficulty.
Yes,
and
yes.
The fact that we can take that for granted now, and that it seems self-evident and deserving of faint praise, it's not so clear to me that that's a reasonable proposition.
Okay, let's grant the faint praise, but that has nothing to do with the truth value. And what I care about is the truth value. I see no truth value in the claims of Christianity, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the miracles? Do you believe in any of those? Do you believe Jesus was born a virgin?
As I said before, there are elements of the text that I don't feel qualified to comment on. My experience has been that the more, I know from a metaphorical perspective and from a mythic perspective what the story of the virgin birth means, and I accept that. I know, for example, that any culture that doesn't hold the image of the woman and infant sacred dies. And I don't know how that needs to be expressed in a form.
Is it true, though?
Do you mean that you don't know?
Well,
Dawkins is making an evidence-based argument. Christianity as a belief system doesn't hold up to scrutiny. There's no empirical evidence for the virgin birth, resurrection, or miracles. None of these claims meet the standards of historical verification. For example, Bart Ehrman, a respected New Testament scholar, points out that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death by anonymous authors, full of contradictions and theological bias. That's not reliable evidence, it's religious tradition. When Peterson talks about holding the mother and child sacred, he shifts to metaphor. But metaphors don't prove anything. They might feel meaningful, but they're not evidence for a god, a virgin birth, or divinity. Dawkins stays focused on truth. Peterson avoids the question entirely. When Dawkins is asked something, he gives a clear answer. When Peterson is asked, he deflects. That's why Dawkins calls it out. Maybe Peterson doesn't actually believe these things and doesn't want to admit it. And the idea that Christianity led us toward mercy and tolerance? History doesn't support that. The Inquisition, witch trials, slavery justified by Scripture, and opposition to women's rights and science all came from dominant Christian cultures. Progress came in spite of religion, not because of it. Led by secular thinkers like Voltaire, Thomas Paine, Bertrand Russell, and modern human rights advocates. Dawkins is right to say, cultural familiarity doesn't mean truth, and religious comfort doesn't equal evidence. Let's continue watching.
Let me ask you about that, because truth, this is something I talked with Sam Harris about too. Truth, as we know, is a tricky business. Do you think there are differences in the truth claims between different writers of fiction? Like, is Dostoevsky more profound than...
No, well, I wouldn't call fiction truth claims anyway. I mean, these are...
Then on what grounds do we rank order the fiction in terms of quality? Like, Dostoevsky is a profound purveyor of fiction on the philosophical front, unbelievably deep and profound.
Yes,
There's something true about what he's writing about.
It's nothing to do with the truth that science is concerned with. The truth of science is the truth that gets us to the moon. I mean, this is nothing to do with whether one writer of fiction has a sort of insight into human nature. That goes without saying. I accept that.
Okay, so how do we deal with the notion that on the purely factual side, how do we deal with the idea, let's take you talked about clitoridectomy, let's talk about the oppression of women.
Yes.
We make a scientific case that that's inappropriate? Or is it a case that we're making on some other grounds? Like I see in the Judeo-Christian tradition, one of the earliest pronouncements is that both men and women carry the image of God, both. And that sets a certain tone to everything that follows. And it is a remarkable proclamation given its radical age, that both men and women carry the image of God and are to be treated as something with intrinsic value outside of the domain of power and politics. And it isn't obvious to me, having thought about this a lot, how we deal with that in the pure realm of fact. Because one of the facts is, if I can oppress you, why the hell shouldn't I?
Yeah, my job is to keep things on track here. I think there are a number of questions which Professor Dawkins has asked quite directly that we still haven't really heard an answer for.
Okay.
And Professor Dawkins asking about the virgin birth. You started talking about metaphor, you started talking about myth. I think anybody listening to this conversation will understand that maybe a society that doesn't believe in the virgin birth won't work. Maybe that's the predictive power that you're talking about. But I think you must understand that when Professor Dawkins is asking you, do you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? He means something like a biological fact. And by the way, saying I don't know, or saying, I'm not qualified to comment, is an answer to that question, but is that your answer, that you don't know? I
said earlier, and I would hold to this, is that there are elements of the text that I don't know that I'm incapable of fully accounting for. I can't account for what what the fundamental reality and significance of the notion of the resurrection is. My knowledge just ends.
Sure, but
I know that whatever happened as a consequence of the origination and the promotion of the Christian story was powerful enough to bring Rome to its knees and demolish the pagan enterprise. So there's some power in that story that's remarkable.
Let's stick to the virgin birth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, well, the virgin birth results from a mistranslation of Isaiah. You know that.
Like these sorts of questions, what would you say? They don't strike me as, they're not getting to the point.
I know
the
that.
story
I know
has
you
a
think
purpose.
that. Yes.
Well, and look, I understand that there's perfect reasons to debate this. I know that, and I know that your question is more than valid, but it's beside the issue as far as I'm concerned, and it's partly because, well, when we started this conversation, I said, for example, that it appears to be the case that a description of the structure through which we see the world is a story. We see the world through a story. And so that's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable discovery, and it's emerged probably in the last 60 years in multiple disciplines, because we have to prioritize our facts. And so we prioritize them according to a particular pattern. And there are patterns that seem to work and to propagate themselves properly and to orient cultures towards life abundant. And there are other patterns, the pattern of Cain, for example, that lead to absolute bloody devastation. And I don't know exactly how to construe that sort of truth, but we talked about the oppression of women, for example. It's like, how do you make a case on purely factual grounds that women should be treated as equals?
It's a moral question, and
I know that's exactly.
And I was dealing with a factual question, which is, did Jesus have a father? And you won't answer it.
Well,
It's
Jesus
a different
had an
kind of
earthly
question.
father and a heavenly father, like almost all mythological heroes.
So he wasn't born of a virgin then? So you're saying that Jesus was not born of a virgin?
I said, first of all, that I don't know how to mediate the fact-value dichotomy in that case. I said the same thing about the resurrection.
It's not a value. It's a simple fact. I mean, did a man have intercourse with Mary and produce Jesus? That's a factual question.
Dawkins asked a simple question. Was Jesus born of a virgin? Peterson danced around it for minutes without answering. That's exactly the problem Dawkins is pointing out. If the core claims of Christianity can't be answered as facts, they collapse under basic scrutiny. The virgin birth isn't just unverified, it's based on a mistranslation. The original Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14 is Alma, which means young woman, not virgin. The Greek Septuagint mistranslated it as Parthenos, meaning virgin, and that error made its way into the Gospels. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and Geza Vermes confirm this. It's not controversial, it's academic consensus. Peterson tries to say these stories are powerful because they moved culture, but power doesn't prove truth. Islam, communism, and Nazi ideology also moved millions. That doesn't make them true. He also claims Christianity elevated women. But the Bible repeatedly treats women as property. Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 22, and even Paul's letters instruct women to submit. The real progress for women came through secular law, civil rights movements, and feminist philosophy, not scripture. And when Dawkins asks again, did Jesus have a human father? Peterson still won't say. That's why Dawkins is right. If the answers don't hold up when plainly asked, then the claims don't deserve to be treated as truth. Let's keep watching.
It's not a value question.
You must understand what you're being asked here, that even if you think that, say, the author of the biblical texts intended much more significance than a simple scientific analysis of events, Professor Dawkins is interested in scientific truth. That's the kind of truth that he's interested in. And even if you think it's irrelevant to the point of what the gospel authors were getting at, that first needs to be clarified before you can then begin actually uncovering what the stories are about. So I think Professor Dawkins is asking from a scientific perspective, and maybe you think that that scientific approach is wrong, but if you just take it for a moment, maybe this is how we find out that it is wrong. Let's take a scientific approach, ask the question, did this occur?
I think that it's inappropriate to use a question like that to attempt to undermine the validity of the entire, what would you say, deep mythological enterprise.
Well, suppose we weren't doing that. Suppose we were asking out of interest. Suppose that we were all here devout Christians, maybe even Jungian Christians, and we thought, this is interesting, over dinner. Do you think it really happened, like scientifically? Would your answer just be, I don't know?
Yes.
And you wouldn't consider it, I mean, it's not an inappropriate question to ask, just on a point of interest.
Right.
Did this really occur? And I think so often people are asking you that, and especially given the context of this conversation, we've heard everything that you're saying about metaphor and myth, but because the question is still then being asked, did it really happen? You know that that's what you're being asked. And the way you just so easily said yes, I wonder why you struggle to do that in so many other circumstances.
I think because I don't look at the situation the same. The way that Dr. Dawkins and I look at the situation are really quite different, and at many, many, many levels. You know, so even on the meme question, for example, you know, like, I know the literature on the history of religious ideas. I see how these ideas have battled across millennia in a manner that is very reminiscent to me of the same sort of claim that Dr. Dawkins is putting forward with regards to meme. I know that literature. Dr. Dawkins doesn't know that literature. And it's very difficult for me to communicate from within the confines of that literature because it's extensive and deep. And we're dealing with things that we don't understand the relationship between metaphoric truth and value predicated truth and factual truth. We don't understand that. It's a big problem. There's no evidence whatsoever from the scientific perspective that we can orient ourselves in the world merely in consequence of the facts.
Sure.
And that's a fact. And it's a fact that's been detailed out in great detail in the last 60 years by people from a variety of different disciplines. We have to prioritize the facts. That's a value hierarchy. There may be true and false ways of prioritizing facts, but you can't determine the truth or falsehood of the way that you prioritize facts by making reference to the facts. That's a big problem.
Okay, let's talk about that as perhaps a slight detour here, because I think we do need to come back to this Christ resurrection thing. But Professor Dawkins, would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption? You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption at its base?
I suppose it does. I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, by the way. I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievements of landing a spacecraft on a comet. These are the things that science can do. And as I said, the predictions of quantum theory, to come back to that, the predictions of quantum theory, which are verified to a sufficient number of decimal places that it's equivalent to predicting the width of North America to one hair's breadth. Now, that is, however difficult quantum theory is to understand, that is what you can get from quantum theory. Now, the mysteries of the Bible, if they are mysteries, aren't in the same league. I mean, they just don't cut it.
Peterson keeps dodging a basic question. Did the virgin birth or resurrection happen as a fact? He talks about myth, metaphor, and the power of stories, but that's not the issue. Dawkins is asking for evidence, not symbolism. Peterson claims truth can't just be about facts, but that's not how we build reliable knowledge. Science is based on observation, testing, and replication, and it works. We can date the Earth to 4.54 billion years with radiometric dating. We can trace the evolution of life through fossils and DNA. And we can land probes on comets using quantum calculations accurate to fractions of a nanometer. That's truth we can build on. Compare that to the Bible. No evidence for a global flood, no external confirmation of the Exodus, and no verifiable proof of a virgin birth or resurrection. These aren't mysteries. They're claims made without evidence. Peterson wants to treat myth as equal to science, but stories are not substitutes for facts. And when Peterson says Dawkins doesn't understand religious literature, that doesn't change the problem. Truth claims require evidence, not familiarity with ancient texts. Dawkins is right. Prioritizing facts over comforting myths is how we make progress. What do you think? Should society lean on ancient stories, or should we demand truth backed by real evidence? Like the video, subscribe for more sharp commentary, and let's keep thinking critically, together.
You both think or believe will happen after you die?
I imagine my wife will get married to somebody else, and actually, she's going to run off with a friend of hers and have a whole bunch of cats. Oh, you mean what's going to happen to me? I don't know. I don't see any reason to think that anything's going to happen to me. Everything that makes me me, everything that we have historically and religiously attributed to a soul that can be identified with a place has a place in the brain. My personality is in my brain. We know from experiments on people who have suffered all sorts of brain damage that you can reset people's personality, their preference, their memories, their ability to make new memories. I'm going to get the name wrong. Vishwanathon. Somebody will know. Anyway, did a talk at one of the religion summits about a split brain patient, hemispherectomy. They can communicate with both halves, and each half has a separate personality and a separate identity and communicates independently. One half, Christian. The other half, atheist. Now, I guess you could argue that when we split that brain in half, there was only enough soul for one side, and the other side just got, shafted. But everything we know about what makes us us, our likes, our preferences, our desires, they're all a product of the brain. Now, a lot of theists would say that there's a soul behind it all, as a puppet master, the ghost in the machine. And yet there's no evidence to support this. And it doesn't make sense in the model. If I suffer severe brain damage and all of a sudden I don't remember the past, I don't remember that I love my wife, I don't like the same foods, I don't want to interact with the same people, and now all of a sudden I believe in God, am I the same person? I don't think so. Haven't we really kind of ended up with a whole new person? I have an argument that I use partially as a joke. It's an argument that demonstrates, according to some traditions, nobody's in heaven, and it's really easy. In heaven, there's no suffering and no sadness, according to some traditions. My mom is convinced she's going to heaven. She's convinced I'm going to hell. I don't know who's going to end up in heaven, but it won't be my mom. There's no way my mom could be up in heaven, not suffering and not sad that her son is in hell. And if God does some kind of magic to take that out of her, it's not my mom anymore. It's a facsimile of my mom. Some kind of robotic worshiping thing that's not my mom. My mom and I disagree vehemently on religious stuff, so much so we don't talk about it anymore because we love each other and we'd like to have a civil, Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever religious holiday drives me up there to visit and hang out. By the way, we celebrate Christmas, have a big white tree with peppermints and stuff on it. It's awesome. Entirely secular stuff. We're stealing it back because Christianity stole most of those things from other religions. And Easter too, but I'm not that big on eggs and candy because I'm diabetic. But everything that we know about us takes place in our brain. The brain gets damaged. Are you the same person? I don't know. The math on souls is confusing. Sam Harris has talked about the math on souls for people who believe that zygotes get a soul because the embryo will sometimes split and then we get together. So when it splits, does it have two souls? And then when it comes back together, does it just have one? Or now do we have a body with two souls? Or did we not put a soul in until afterwards? Or does it happen when he breathes the first breath, as the Jews believed? It doesn't make any sense. The math on souls doesn't make sense. The science on souls doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to think that there's some kind of ghost dictating what goes on in my brain. We haven't even gotten into free will. Cliff keeps asserting that we have it. I'm not convinced we do, at least not in the sense that he's talking about. I don't know what's going to happen to me when I'm dead. I'm pretty sure my body's going to rot, my brain's going to stop working, and I will cease to exist. And it didn't bother me before I was alive, so I don't see what'd bother me afterwards.
When Matt says everything we are, our thoughts, memories, personality, comes from the brain, he's not just guessing. We have real evidence for that. Brain scans show that damage to specific areas can completely change how a person behaves. People with strokes or brain injuries sometimes lose their ability to recognize loved ones, form memories, or even control their emotions. There's also the famous case of split brain patients. When the brain is divided, each half can act like its own person, sometimes with completely different beliefs. If a soul were running the show, how does that even make sense? Matt brings up a good point about heaven, too. If someone you love goes to hell, but you're not sad in heaven, are you really you anymore? It sounds more like a version of you with your emotions turned off. That's not comforting. It's unsettling. And scientifically, we've never found any evidence of a soul. No energy, no signal, no mechanism. It's all based on belief, not observation. Now, let's hear what Cliff has to say about this.
Guys, we got to be honest with each other. If there is no God, we know exactly what happens when we die. If there is no God, there's no life after death. If there is no God, you are matter and energy. And when you die, the matter and energy fall apart. So let's not act like maybe there's life after death. No, that's illogical. If there is no God, when you die, when I die, we become fertilizer. Very logical, very reasonable. But you know what the problem is? The problem is that I've got to do funerals for families that are atheist or agnostic. Inevitably, what happens to me is I'm standing there and they're coming up to me saying, well, you know, maybe, the Great Spirit. Excuse me? Great Spirit? What are you talking about? If there is no God, there's no spirit. There's matter and energy. And when we die, the matter and energy falls apart. Now, don't get scared. Just face reality. Be objective. And don't allow your fears to get you knocking your knees saying, oh, well, maybe. Oh, well, possibly. No. Be rational. Use your good mind. If there is no God, when you die, you rot. When I die, I rot. End of story. Just think about it. Now, there's an alternative to that. And the alternative is that if there's a supernatural God, then possibly there is life after death. And I can promise you, I would never believe there's life after death because I'm scared to die. That's being a wimp. That's being a coward. Instead, you'd better use your brain, and you better start thinking, and you better figure out, does the evidence point to there being something more to reality than matter and energy, there being some type of God, or does there not? And then secondly, you better use your brain, and you better think real clearly. Does the historical evidence point to Jesus having died and risen from the dead or not? And I can promise you, if you believe there's life after death because you're scared to die, you're an intellectual wimp. And I would never believe there's life after death because I find it attractive. And Matt is wrong. I don't believe there's life after death because I've got this deep longing for life after death. But I'll tell you exactly what I do. If I find that I have a deep longing for something, I look at the evidence to find out, is there any truth to it or not? And if there's no truth to it, I drop it. But if there is evidence to support it, I would be very wise to follow that evidence. Now, why do I believe there's life after death? First of all, because the evidence is there is a supernatural God. And second of all, because the historical evidence is that Jesus was dead, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead. And the people who saw him risen from the dead died for, not for belief, they died for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. If you claim to have seen something, like Matthew, Mark, John, Thomas, Philip, Andrew, Peter, if you claim to have seen the dead Christ risen from the dead, and then you stand before Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers say Caesar is Lord and live, or else maintain that Jesus is risen from the dead, and we will execute you for it. And if you stand there and say, I'm sorry, I've seen Jesus risen from the dead, that gives your claim tremendous credibility. So the evidence is Jesus rose from the dead. That's why I'm convinced when he promises you eternal life, if you trust in him, he ain't blowing smoke. He's speaking the truth.
Cliff says if there's no God, we just rot. That part is true. What he gets wrong is assuming that's a problem. Just because the idea of death is uncomfortable doesn't make something else magically true. That's not evidence. That's wishful thinking. He also says people died for what they saw, as if martyrdom proves truth. But people die for all kinds of beliefs: Muslims, Hindus, even cult members like Heaven's Gate. Dying for something doesn't prove it's real. It just shows how strongly someone believed it. Cliff brings up Jesus' resurrection like it's a historical fact, but we don't have first-hand evidence. The Gospels were written decades later, anonymously, and contradict each other in key details. That's not strong historical data. It's hearsay. Hitchens was right to say, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And so far, Cliff hasn't given any evidence, just emotional appeals and stories written down 2,000 years ago. Let's hear Matt one more time.
One is this continued objection to, without God, there's no ultimate meaning. There's no real purpose. Well, I don't know what you mean by real purpose. That seems kind of cheaty. But as far as ultimate meaning, yes, I agree. No ultimate meaning in the existential sense that you're talking about it. And it doesn't matter one bit. The car that I've got out there parked in the parking lot, I've had for a couple of years. One of these days, it's going to rot away. Does that mean it's not valuable now? Does that mean it doesn't have any value to me now? I mean, there's no purpose, so I just go ahead and chuck it now? Let's get rid of it. Eventually, it's going to be useless. That's absurd. We all recognize that things have meaning and purpose right now because they are valuable to us. These are properties that we imbue things with and we imbue people with. Do I matter as much to you as your spouse? Bet you I don't, unless it's you. This idea that without the ultimate meaning, or if something is ultimately meaningless, doesn't mean it is always meaningless, or it doesn't mean it's meaningless in every way. This idea about morality, that it's all relative. Actually, I'm a staunch defender of absolute morality. And despite Cliff's straw man, I'm not saying that slavery is immoral because I said so. It might surprise some people to know that while I don't think there's intrinsic value, I think that there is value in people, and that's the value that we imbue them with. This idea that because I said so is the basis for secular morality is flatly absurd. It's the exact opposite of what I just finished talking about how you go through and you build up this system. We are physical beings in a physical universe that follows physical laws. There are truths to be discovered about how our actions benefit us and how our actions harm us. This is simply true. We don't need another mind. This is about the interaction of minds, but we don't need some transcendent mind to dictate what is true. We discover what is true about the reality that we inhabit. God or not, soul or not, we can choose everything on the list that Cliff just talked about being good to each other and building a productive society and caring and loving and trying to end poverty, trying to end oppression, and trying to build a better society. We can do all of that just because it's the right thing to do. There's no evidence for a soul. In fact, there's good evidence against it. There's no evidence or not enough evidence of the various God claims that are out there, or not any particular good evidence, at least that I've been made aware of. But I could be wrong. And tomorrow, I could find out that there is a God and that I do have a soul. And it wouldn't change very much for me as far as how I end up living my life, because I've already come to good reasons to do things. I'm open to being corrected on them, but what's going to correct me is reason and evidence, not appealing to a God. And if people have asked me, well, what are you going to do if you die and you end up standing before God? Hey, I tried. I used my brain. I followed the evidence where it was. And by the way, if your character is actually accurately depicted in the Bible or the Quran, I don't want nothing to do with you. I'm already morally superior to you. I already care more about people than you do. I know. I've never sanctioned slavery, never sanctioned genocide. Gods have. Do all religions lead to the same God? I don't know. I think it's unlikely. I think they clearly all define God differently. I think you could go right down into the same church on the same pew and get two different people, and they're going to define God differently, and they're going to have different views of God. I think there's as many different religions as there are people trying to practice them. And my concern isn't whether or not they all lead to the same God. It's what kind of world do they end up creating? Because why should I care about an afterlife that I don't know whether or not it exists when I've got a life that I know that I have and I'd like to make it better? And if your religion is impeding on the ability of people who don't practice your religion or those who do from living the best life they can right now, then your religion's a problem. That goes for Islam and Christianity and Scientology and Hinduism and everything. If you're advocating something that is detracting from the good of this world, you're part of the problem.
Does being an atheist require the same faith that believing in God does?
No, seriously. It doesn't require any faith to not believe something. It doesn't. Now, if atheism was this assertion that there are no gods, ooh, I pissed some people off. If atheism was this assertion that there are no gods, well, then yes, you might be able to make a case that that was based on faith, or maybe it's not. It would depend on what the basis, what the foundation for that particular belief was. But atheism in the weak atheism sense of I do not believe this doesn't require faith. I don't believe there's a Bigfoot. That's not a faith. It's not a faith-based position. I'm not asserting certainty that there isn't a Bigfoot. I'm just not yet convinced. The Bigfoot claim hasn't met its burden of proof. Neither of alien abductions, which, by the way, I'll point out, you can actually go talk to real living people right now who will tell you their alien abduction story. Living, breathing people, you can talk to them. They will have stories that are similar in detail. In some cases, there are multiple people who have supposedly experienced this together. In some cases, the things that people have seen have been entire small towns. And you can interview these people. How many people think that they're actually being abducted by aliens? Not me. That's people you can talk to right now. Somebody writes a couple books, in a couple thousand years, somebody could stand up and say, hey, look, I wouldn't believe it, but look at all of these accounts. These are firsthand people. They were interviewed by the news. We have a much better record of what was happening at the end of the 20th and beginning of 21st century than we do about what happened back when Jesus was supposedly alive or back around the time that Hinduism was being formed. This is a real record. We even have video footage of people talking about how they came down. And then they'll start tying it together in an intricate little web, the same way conspiracy theorists do right now. Oh, there were lizard people in the government or crop circles out there. We don't believe in any of that, I hope. I am at Texas State. I kind of respect you guys because I don't care about colleges, so we're not in any rivalry. UT. But we don't believe that. Why should we? And yet we're expected to believe what is potentially a more extraordinary claim and weaker evidence. There's nothing particularly extraordinary about a universe that's billions, 13.7 billion years old, that there might be some other life somewhere. I don't know. Probably unlikely they made it this far. No reason for them to pick out Earth because we're not special, despite what many creationists would have you believe. They've got this wily coyote god who straps on a hat and balances on a wire and goes through all...
Matt makes a powerful case here. You don't need God to have meaning, purpose, or morality, and science backs him up. Studies in neuroscience, psychology, and evolutionary biology show that humans are wired for empathy, cooperation, and moral reasoning. Not because of religion, but because these traits helped us survive and thrive as social beings. Purpose doesn't have to come from some ultimate source to be real. It can come from love, family, creativity, curiosity, things we build and share. Just because something ends doesn't mean it was worthless. That's true for life, relationships, and even a good story. As for morality, Matt's right again. Objective moral systems can be built without appealing to a higher power. We observe the consequences of our actions. We learn what causes harm and what creates well-being. That's reason. That's evidence. And that's enough. Matt doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He just refuses to accept bad ones. He's willing to change his mind, but only for a good reason. That's intellectual honesty. And that's the foundation for a better world. So here's the question. If the life you're living now is the only one you're sure you have, what are you doing to make it count? Like this video if you found it thought-provoking. Subscribe for more honest debates and evidence-based commentary.